Previously, I've done two good and bad videos. I did one for the Lycaeus trilogy, and I did one for the Wheel of Time. And for whatever reason, people have said, oh, well, you just do the good and the bad series because it's a series that you feel like has some redeeming qualities, but you just like to dunk on. You aren't ever going to do this about series that you adore. And I said, all right, check this out. Hey, what's up, bookworms and all my little grimdark cuties? Mike back today to talk some more Joe Abercrombie. Today we're talking about the good and the bad of the First Law series. Now this is going to cover all the books in the series, but what I'm going to really talk about is where it all began in 2006 with a little book called The Blade itself, all the way through the new book coming out this September, The Wisdom of Crowds, which will be the end of the sequel trilogy to that original trilogy. I just want to make sure that people know this isn't just for that original trilogy. I'm going to be talking about the whole series as a whole. Now, these are going to be spoiler-free, obviously. This is really something that I like to do if you've been kind of on the edge and you kind of need to just some more than what people just tell you. A lot of times, why should I read it? People are just like, it's good, just read it. I mean, that isn't going to help anybody decide anything. Really, it isn't, guys. Because if that was the case, there's a lot of books out there I'd read that I have no interest in reading because people just say, it's good, just read it. With this, I like to do with the good and bad is talk about maybe some of the things that absolutely I love and then some things that, hey, if you aren't feeling this, or this, it might not be the series for you. Now, always, guys, these are subjective. These are just my opinions. So things that I have listed as good, you may not consider those good. Things I have listed as bad, you may say, this guy's crazy. That's a great thing. I'm going to kind of break it down how I feel about it. But yes, elephant in the room, guys. The First Law series is my favorite modern fantasy series. It is my favorite fantasy series not written by someone called J.R.R. Tolkien. It is very, very dear to me. So yes, I'm going to be nitpicky to find things bad. Now, these are going to be things I think might be considered bad by you. So again, it feels like a fine line there to walk, but we're going to kind of do that. Again, I've done spoiler reviews, guy, for every single book on this channel. You can find those all here. I got a playlist for everything. Now, those are spoiler reviews. I have thought about going back and doing those. The Why You Should Read is spoiler-free, but everything else is straight spoiler reviews. I think I have one for non-spoiler for the sequel trilogies when I first started, but those are back when I first started this channel, and I thought, hey, you know what? It might be time to kind of redo some of those. So that just kind of depends on you guys. If that's something that you guys would like to see me do, standard reviews for the First Law books, I'd love to talk about those books again, because honestly, when the channel first started, I didn't quite have the structure that I have now. So, but again, with the good and the bad series, like I said, just kind of trying to help new readers decide if they want to read this. So let's start, guys, with the good of the First Law series. Now, number one, the best thing for me in this series is Joe Abercrombie's character work. No one in modern fantasy is able to write defining characters like him. What I mean by defining is you can read one sentence of dialogue, boom, you know what character it is, because each character is so distinguished, so different, so differentiated, you're going to know who is who right away. And they're all going to feel completely different. And you're going to love or love to hate every single one of them. It's amazing the size of the cast in this and the size of the body count. And you find yourself getting attached to characters that a lot of people might not consider good people. That's the thing. They are all morally gray, very morally gray. There are no good guys or bad guys within the world of the First Law. It is very much people trying to make their way. It is a very cruel and punishing world. It is very much in the same vein as Westeros in A Song of Ice and Fire, in that, yeah, it's tough to stay alive in this universe because things are so hopeless sometimes. Things are so bleak. And there is that fine line between where is good or evil. Everyone's just kind of right in the middle, So I think that's the thing that really captured me when I read this for the first time. Was like, wow, this is the first time I've read a book where most of these characters are just bastards. And I find myself rooting for them, and I don't understand why. But I think that, like I said, there's no characters called heroes or villains, and that you'll find yourself, okay, this character that I'm really, really rooting for, this would be the villain in some traditional fantasy books that I've read. And it's amazing that he's able to do that. I really think that is his gift. But every character is damaged mentally or physically or both. These characters all have fatal flaws. They all have problems. They all have things that you'd be like, okay, in any other book, this is a character that's not going to make it to the end because they're just so messed up. And there's some that are trying to do better. There's some who are basically like just learning to embrace that not so good side of them. And again, that's what makes them all so unique and so special. And you can't look at anyone in this book and then go to the third book, which is Last Argument of Kings, and feel like they aren't changed. So the character growth that he gives these characters just in those first 3 books, and the ones that have continued on to the sequel trilogy, it's quite amazing what he's able to do with that. And I think what makes this series so special to me is this isn't the... I guess a lot of modern fantasy modern fantasy writers like to basically flex their prose muscles and build their world. They like to show you how good of a wordsmith they are, which there's nothing wrong with. There's nothing wrong with that at all. I'm not taking away from that. And they like to build their world. They like to give you lots of exposition to get you feeling like you know this world inside and out. Joe, he does this with his characters. And then he basically lets you discover the world on your own slowly through the 8 books in the series that have been released thus far. So the world does get built. It's just not done in the way that you are used to. He really spends that time on his characters. And I, a character first guy, love that about this series. It makes it so special. Guys, this is peak grimdark. It's a term that everyone throws around loosely. Is this series grim? Is Malazan grimdark? Well, I don't know. I'd argue this. Is that grimdark? I don't know. It has this, it has that. This is grimdark, okay? This is pretty much set the bar for me personally. Every other series that I read that claims it's grimdark, and I read it and I'm like, yeah, your world is nihilistic, but I don't care about your characters. See, that's what I feel like Joe is able to find that fine line, is he will take this world that is absolutely cruel and punishing and has no remorse for any of his characters, but you find yourself hurt when you lose one of them, or when bad things happen to them, you find yourself wanting them to succeed. And I feel like, for example, everyone said Mark Lawrence, Broken Empire, is the most comparable to the First Law. Yeah, except his characters are complete psychopaths, and I never really clicked with them. With this, I loved all these characters, and that's why their story mattered. The end of Broken Empire, I could have cared less if the main character achieved his goals. But I'm not trying to tear something else down. I'm just giving you guys an example of every other grimdark series I've been recommended. Some have been good, yeah, but they've never quite hit the same note for me as this has, because he develops his characters so well. So I can't state enough how well his character work. Best character work of any modern author I've read outside of Stephen King today. If you still count, Stephen King's still putting out 2 books a year, I'm still counting him as a modern author, okay? Something else I like is, I talk about this cruel and unforgiving world. It almost seems like hope is a myth. And you would think that'd really drag you down in a book. But with this, it feels like a bigger hill for our characters to climb. So when or if they achieve those goals, it feels so much more rewarding. So yes, it does feel hope, but you do feel a lot of times like you're just down in the muck. But it's never like not a pleasure to read. Does that make sense? Because there are lots of other series that feel like that, but sometimes it's like, okay, this is just putting me in a bad mood. I feel like Eeyore with a rain cloud over my head. Now, you will feel like that sometimes just because in that Song of Ice and Fire Away, it's just like, oh my God, does this guy care about his characters at all? Because he has no problems taking them away from you. But yeah, it will feel quite bleak at times, but never in a way that's not enjoyable, I don't think. And I think he fixes that with his twisted humor. It was something that Joe Hill, that's Stephen King's son, he reviewed. A great writer on his own. I just like to, a lot of people still don't know that Joe Hill is Stephen King's son. Nosferatu, great book, by the way. Anyway, Lock and Key, one of the greatest comics ever. I just know that the guy's probably like, can we just call him Joe Hill now? Anyhow, I derail all the time, guys. I apologize. I think it was what he put on the back of The Trouble with Peace. He said it was hilarious and twistingly funny or something like that. And I was like, yeah, because I read First Law, I think funny. And I started thinking about it, I was like, you know what? I do laugh a lot while I read these books, because there are lines of dialogue that Joe will write, and you'll be like, any other author wrote that, and you would just cringe, and you would just laugh, and you would put the book down. With him, you're laughing, and you can't wait to see what happens next. You can't wait to see the response to what that character says. So yes, he has witty banter, extremely quotable lines. I dare you not to be quoting Logan Nine Fingers or Galacta after you finish this series in your daily life. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. Another thing I really do like, and this is just me, if you're one of those people who loves a heavy magic system, you might not like this. It is a very soft magic system. It's very much in like the tone of Lord of the Rings. With Lord of the Rings, it's like, yeah, Gandalf's a wizard. That's why he can do magic. That's what you need to know. You have magic users in this series, but this series is really much about when we start moving away from magic and moving into the industrial age eventually, because this series does take place over 31 years. So yeah, it's a very soft magic system. I don't need a heavy magic system to enjoy a series. I'm fine with the heavy magic system, but I don't require it, so that one kind of might depend on you. But this book, guys, look, just unpredictable plot twists. You'll have the smartest guy in the room being like, oh, I saw that coming. I don't see how, because several of these completely left me with my jaw on the floor, and I did not see it coming at all. I think that there are some of the most insane battles that you ever see. I think that this guy writes just the battle sequence like no one else. I think maybe John Gwynn's come the closest for me in really describing battles this way, where it's just like you just can't look away. You can't blink while you're reading because it's just so intense and you feel like you're there. And again, major character deaths. When I first read this series, I had read Song of Ice and Fire at that point, so I was used to an author not being scared to take the characters away from me, but it was as powerful as A Song of Ice and Fire in that when you do lose those major characters, it's like, no, you can see it coming, and you're like grabbing their name and trying to pull it back in the book, and it just isn't happening, guys. So, yes, there are very, very meaningful deaths in this, and you will lose someone that you're attached to. It will happen. I guarantee it. The body count is high, but it's never unearned, ever, not a single time. And I think the world building through the standalone books is something that is really good. I hear a lot of people all the time, okay, you have your original trilogy, your first 3 books, and then you have these 3 books in between that and the sequel trilogy, and people are always like, well, do I need to read those? Look, if you read the first trilogy and you like it and you want to continue, yes, read the standalone books because they build his world. They flesh out his world. It isn't the same characters. There's some returning characters. You'll see some. But again, this takes place over decades. There's these standalone books. And you get to know other places around the circle of the world. You get to know all these other continents that you've wanted to know about. And he fleshes out. That's where I talked about, like, the first trilogy, very character-driven. There's some traveling, but not a lot. You hear a lot about rumors over to the east. You hear a lot of stuff about what happened over here in the west. You want to know more about what's going on in Gurkle, all those things. And you get that in those standalone books. And I think that's the most important thing that those books do, is they build his whole world out quite a bit. So when you get to that sequel trilogy, when he mentions all those lands, you aren't like, oh, he never talked about this in the first trilogy. Yeah, he talked about it in those standalone books. So don't skip the standalones. They're very much worth your time. They're very good, and they do continue to build his world. And like I said, this is a timeline, guys, through 9 books that spans 31 years, and they all matter. So I can't say enough about why you should read this series because of these great, great things. But guys, there are some bad things here. Okay, I am not going to lie. None of these things I have listed on bad are bad for me. I can see how they would be bad for a first-time reader. Now, look, if you haven't read grimdark before, yes, these are going to be bad for you because you're not ready. You're not ready. Grimdark, if all you've read is like Wheel of Time and Lord of the Rings, this is going to be a culture shock to you because it is very dark, it is very brutal, it's very gruesome, and it has a lot of bad language. It has a lot of bad things happening to men and women. I'll put it that way. So, again, cruel and unforgiving world. It's not going to be happy. You're not going to be smiling a ton. Like I said, it has that humor once you get used to it, but at first it might be quite shocking to you. Like, oh my God, what am I getting myself into here? This just feels like juvenile. And yes, that's a great word for it. You will feel like that at first. But unlike traditional fantasy, there is no clear-cut protagonist in this. I mean, you have someone I think you're going to kind of latch onto rather early, but there is no clear-cut, there is no Rand al'Thor in this story that you're supposed to be rooting for. There is no Frodo Baggins. You're going to very much be like, well, I kind of like this character, but I don't think he's kind of an adversary to this character, which I also like, or I don't like either of these, but this one's kind of a jerk, but I find myself rooting for it. It's going to be confusing to you at first. That's going to be kind of a shock for a lot of people who've only read, traditional fantasy. It's going to be tough to get into. But again, the books are incredibly character-driven, like I said, and a big criticism of this book, guys, is that nothing happens. It is very much a character introduction book. They don't even leave the capital in this first book. So a lot of people think, wow, it just feels so small compared to what I'm used to. I try to tell people this, and it's hard for them to understand. I think that the First Law trilogy, the original trilogy, is very much like Lord of the Rings. You can't read one volume. It's not episodic like that. It is one story cut into 3 books. It very much, I mean, book 2 picks up minutes after the first book ends. I mean, that's just how it is. So I tell people, hey, you need to read the first 2 to see if this world's for you. And at that point, you might as well just read the 3 because you'll want to see the resolution to everything that is happening. So it really is, you got to commit to reading the trilogy to get the full story here, because you're not going to get everything answered that you want in book 1. It is not a standalone. It is very much 3 parts of one story. And that's tough for some people. Plot and world building take a back seat, especially in book number 1, and that can be very, very tough for people. And the characters can be wholly unlikable, not going to lie. When I first started reading it, like I said, I had read A Song of Ice and Fire, and I'd actually gotten used to liking some characters that would be considered not that likable. So that helped me a lot. If you've never read grimdark, though, it might be like, why am I following these characters that are just doing terrible, terrible things? You'll see. That's all I'll say. You'll see. But some of them might do things, like there is a few characters that do some things. There's a big one in book number 2, or the end of book 1, but it kind of has a redemption arc in book 2, but it doesn't land for everybody. There's something that he does in book 1 that is past the point of no return for some people. There is no redeeming that. For me, it happened, but it's not going to happen for everybody. And it happens with more than one character like that. So, that one's just kind of going to depend on you. But there are some plot twists, guys, I'm not going to lie, that might seem a little forced. They might seem forced. You might not really feel where they're going with them. For me, I feel like, especially on a reread, and I hate saying that because people say it all the time, Wheel of Time or Malazan, you got to do a reread. Look, this is a trilogy. I had no problem rereading it. I think all 3 of these books are shorter than one Wheel of Time book combined. So it wasn't a problem for me to go back and reread these before the sequel trilogy started coming out. But you will see that all those plot twists, the seeds are planted early. So they were planned. They weren't forced. They're there. But on a first-time read, you might be like, that makes no sense. But trust me, they make sense. But again, that might be a problem for you. And again, the soft magic system might be a problem for you. In the age of Sanderson, a lot of people cutting their fantasy teeth on Brandon Sanderson, they feel like the magic system has to be a main character in their story. With this, magic very much takes a back seat. So if that's a problem for you, and it's probably going to be a mark against. I think that the dialogue is very funny. If you've never read adult fantasy, and this is going to be your first step into it, you're going to be kind of blown away by the dialogue. And you're going to think that some of it's cringe. I'm not going to lie. It's going to be bother you a lot. It might really bug you on some of it. With me, I was laughing. I read this in my 30s. I was having a good time. I was in my late 20s, I guess. I don't know. Time flies these days. But if you've read adult fantasy, you'll be fine. But if this is your first foray into adult fantasy, some of the language and some of the things that the characters say, you might be like, what? Yeah, so be ready. The big bad of this series doesn't really land for everyone. I'm not going to tell you who that big bad is because it is kind of a mystery. But when you find out the big bad, it really, really, it's divisive. It really is, especially on a first read. Most people love it. Most people do, but there are some people who still are not over it because the ending will completely sock you in the mouth. And you're not going to be ready for it, especially if this is your first adventure, like I said, into grimdark. It's not going to be something that you're ready for. There is no Disney ending here. Okay, that's all I'll say. So that some people can't handle that. But I'm like, did you read the first 3 books? Were you expecting this super puppy dogs and rainbows ending kind of thing? But it isn't just because it's a dark ending per se. It's just that it's not your traditional you bow to no one kind of ending. It's very much like, wow, that's really what he went with. It was something that I was actually upset about when I first read it. Then back a couple years went by and I was like, you know what, that was actually quite brilliant. And now I love it. So it really is going to kind of depend on you. I think that the world not feeling really fleshed out at first is going to be a problem for some people, especially modern fantasy readers where world building is number one priority for them. He does build his world. It just takes a while to get there, and he doesn't do it up front. He does it slowly over each book. I prefer it that way. I prefer little bites instead of 200 pages of info dumps. I prefer it that way. But it might bother some people because there are things where lands or characters are mentioned and they're never brought up again, and then you'll hear some mention of them and you'll be like, well, you didn't really tell me that much about them in the first place. So I feel like there's still a lot of room, because like I said, the series does go over the course of 31 years, but there are some big jumps in those numbers of years, and there's things like in the sequel trilogy that are talked about that happened between the first trilogy and the second trilogy. You're like, well, I'd like to know more about this. All I'm hearing about this is secondhand after, decades after the fact. So I hope he's going to continue this world and write about some of those things that took place, before the sequel trilogy. I think that'd be a lot of fun, but that might be, pretty unsatisfying to you at first. But this one is kind of subjective. It's really going to depend on you. I love every book in this series, guys. Do not misunderstand me on that one. But I would say it never reaches the heights that the first trilogy do again. Now, I also think that might be some nostalgia in there. Going back to it, now I think about that trilogy as being perfect. So it's like, can anything top it? It's kind of like that. I mean, it's kind of funny because, we know now that the sequel Star Wars movies were questionable at best. But people were like, is there any chance that they could ever beat the original Star Wars movies? We're like, well, of course not. Those movies were like sacred. I kind of hold this trilogy the same way. It's like, how can you ever top this? So it might feel like, okay, I don't feel like he'll ever reach those heights again. But look, guys, the sequel trilogy is excellent. It really is. It's just, you're longing for some of those legendary characters that you have in that first trilogy, I think. And that's kind of one of the things that kind of holds any sequel back. That's just anything that happens with any sequel, movies, books, whatever. You got a sequel to something that you really loved. How can they surpass it? What can they do without just going over the top with it? And Joe has his own style of over the top. It's never quite like you think. But look, guys, for me, in the end, like I said, this is my favorite fantasy series not written by Mr. Tolkien. And that is the highest distinguished honor that I can give it. And I love it. Memorable characters, incredible adventures. You got witty dialogue. It's just incredibly rereadable. There's so many things. It's so fun, you guys. It's just a ton of fun. And I know I said you won't be having a lot of fun, but once you get used to that world, it will be a lot of fun for you. So I know it sounds like I'm trying to have my cake and eat it too. And you know what? Sometimes that's just going to happen because this is just that unique of a series. That's just going to kind of happen. But in the end, I'm not going to lie. This is not going to be a series for everyone. I usually do my Why You Should Reads as, because I think it's a series that everyone will love. This one, look, I think you will love it if you've read adult fantasy before. If this is your first foray into adult fantasy, it might come as a shock to you. But I look at it as, hey, take your medicine. Sometimes you got to eat your vegetables, to grow a little bit. So that'll probably be the only time in history that the first law is compared to eating your vegetables. So guys, I adore this series. I will be rereading it until I die, for sure. I'm so excited. The sequel trilogy coming out to a close here in September. It's been a hell of a ride. I hope he does continue the world, and I'm super, super excited, guys, that I am going to get to talk to Joe Abercrombie on this channel when that book does come out. We've been emailing back and forth about it. After I get my review copy of Wisdom of Crowds, he said then he wants me to read that first before we talk. So I can't wait. That's something when I first started this channel, I would have never imagined I'd get to talk, one-on-one with my favorite modern-day fantasy author. So I'm very, very excited, and I hope you guys are excited too. And I hope some of you guys that haven't given this series a try will do so, because I think it is going to be something that you end up loving if you just give it a try. So guys, that was the good and the bad of the first law. Obviously a lot more good than bad, but you know what? Again, favorite fantasy series of modern times. So guys, what did you think about the first Law trilogy? Drop in the comments and let me know if you maybe on the edge about trying it. Did this convince you one way or the other? Drop in the comments and let me know, and I will talk to you there.